Hello.
So I'm Joey from KMAC Museum, and I'm here with Vian Sora, an artist living in Louisville, and I wanted to quickly introduce you in context of KMAC. So this is from the KMAC Triennial, which you were in last year, the inaugural Triennial of Artists from the Commonwealth. And the picture on the right has been put into our permanent collection, End of Hostilities. And so I wanted to kind of chat with you today while we're amidst a kind of lockdown and kind of discuss with you what you've been thinking and what this has meant for your practice, how you've dealt with it, both just as a person, but also as an artist. And to kind of maybe hear you start off a little bit about how you've been doing and what you've been up to, and what, if any, has this time kind of informed what you're doing in the studio?
Okay. Thank you, Joey. This is a great platform, and I think it's very interesting that the work that was chosen by KMAC kind of resembles similar time for my work. It was End of Hostilities is a result of a departure point for my work when I was trying to leave behind the war theme that dominated my work, being Iraqi, being an immigrant into this country, and the kind of intensity that controlled my practice for years. And I was trying really hard to organically transition into something else. And this work came in a time where I was ready to let go. And it kind of represents a time of the end of something, the end of a war, it could be the end of pandemic. It's something that leads from, going from point A to Z. And it's kind of a point of release as well. So it's a very intense work. It was very difficult for me it came naturally, but then to wrap the work up was difficult. I almost didn't want to complete the work. So I feel like it's really it's a reflection of our time right now. A lot of what I've been doing in the studio recently is a reflection of the state of working from within, because suddenly the world, most of us, if not all of us, are left with, and especially for artists, are left with, with a lot of time that we always beg for. But also, personally, I'm working from a place within also, where I'm facing my demons in the studio, which is it's a great point to be at, but also it's a great situation for me. But at the same time, I am trying to be honest to the time I'm living. Mm-hmm. So the work is really, it's fragmented, it's shattered and brought back together again. It's also a reflection of the images I'm seeing every day in the news, and there is a lot of information I'm receiving through social media. Whether I choose to see it or not, it's feeding into that new body of work that I'm working on. At the same time, the similarity to the previous body of work with kind of focused on immigration and war and survival, it's this moment where there's a lot of unknown. And of course, it's very different from, being quarantined or sheltered in a war situation where there is bombing outside, there is death. But right now, we're dealing with something that we don't know, and we don't know for how long. And I feel like everybody is begging for that personal connection. So there is this outside world, but then there's this domestic world that is kind of suddenly we're surrounded with. And that has really started to appear with the figures back again into the abstract landscape of my work.
Right, because you used to have a very sort of figurative practice. And for a little while, you sort of moved away from that and focused more on some of these, like this image we're looking at now, some of these abstract moments that occur became a focus for a while, as we saw initially, like in the KMAC show, for example. Outwardly, these have more of an abstract feel. And so now you're moving again back into almost a figurative sort of composition, still involving some of that emotional kind of abstract quality that you normally have. But you're thinking, I guess, about, you said images from the media, you're thinking about bodies, bodies in all kinds of different states of, I don't know, pain or survival.
Yeah, exactly. The human being or the body or the human soul been always a focus in my work. And the last 5 years, I really enjoyed just that kind of intensity between revealing and hiding the body. So you might see it enmesh within kind of like a gestural field within the landscape, but it is appearing again kind of naturally through just, I think because there is all this focus that there's the soul aspect, which this human interaction that I feel like needed by everyone. You know, not everybody was Zooming with their friends who they haven't talked to forever, but suddenly started coming again into our daily life practice. And, you know, just even the domestic life, you know, personally, I'm quarantined here with my husband and cat. And, you know, I think this has started also kind of reflecting that relationship. There's always two figures and a third figure that is hidden somewhere. So things are happening organically, but I'm going back into that, alluding into the figure, but making it the focal point of the composition within the canvas. So, you know, I'm starting to enjoy that again. And I don't know where I'm going to get away. Like, I'm still trying to develop it slowly and not jump into the next new thing that is going to inspire me. So I think that's why it's appearing.
You know, like a lot of artists, I'm sure you were in the midst of planning phases of a lot of projects and exhibitions that you had coming up. You probably had already been thinking about what you wanted to make for those shows. And like a lot of artists, that has been postponed or it's been, you know, derailed completely. But you were probably already in this phase of thinking. I know that you came off a very busy year with a successful solo show at Susan Morman's Gallery, this show at KMAC, and then you took some needed rest and relaxation and traveled and kind of took in a lot of information, and you were headed back to your studio anyway to work on some new projects, and then this happened. And so how different is maybe some of this work from what you were planning on doing, and how is this sort of pandemic maybe change some of that, or is it any different? Or are you kind of proceeding what you were going to make anyway, or has this affected it greatly?
It definitely, the pandemic and the situation we're living within affected the work greatly. But actually, I hate to say that in a good way, because I feel like I have this constant stream of thoughts and ideas that is happening, and it's happening in within, you know, daydreaming even. There's been a new direction in my work, and this situation only started to inform it more and make it more clear to me that this is where I need to go with the work. So there is right now a lot of, you know, I feel like this urgency for me to go into the studio every day. And it became even more directed, because normally I would do that if I'm working for a solo show, and I feel like I have the same urgency, you know, even though there is nothing happening except maybe September, there's a project of a solo exhibit, but I'm still working towards just fulfilling this body of work that is asking me to be painted or executed. But what I'm doing also, more than any other time I did for the last 10 years, is drawing to receive information. I'm drawing a lot of on different sizes of paper before proceeding into the canvas. And I am drawing the same subjects again and again. And I'm not using these drawings to look at and, you know, paint and on the big canvas. I'm actually just executing and repeating as a form of, it's kind of therapeutic for me, but also it's kind of given me a better idea about where I want to reach with the work. So it's been, it's been a very busy time for me, and it's been very kind of true to what's happening versus a lot of the exhibitions previously dealing with previous subjects. This body of work is related directly to the time we're living in and to the pandemic.
Could you talk a little bit about, I know that in the sort of case of like some of this previous work where like this painting here in the middle, where you would have a very kind of identifiable figure sort of appear amidst the abstraction. And this is something that you were kind of toying with. And now you've kind of returned to some of these pieces where the figure is a little more defined with the line like you maybe were doing in the past. Could you talk a little about the differences in those two, if you do see them as different, or what this figure refers to, and what are some of the connections that the two kind of figurative approaches kind of represent for you?
The first one, verdict, I believe that yes, the verdict is this kind of figures that kind of ask to be kind of highlighted, that happens from within the landscape versus the ones that is highlighted with a line. For me, they are essential to the work. They're both represent, for me, like results of subjects that I'm trying to process. But in the same time, it's this obsessive kind of process that leads into creating these figures that I'm interested in. And a lot of my works are experimental. I don't walk in the work deciding the end result of it. What happens normally is, you know, of course, my daily life that is happening will kind of show on the work as well. But the figures are kind of creating themselves. So a lot of the ones that is happening from the abstract itself is that shattered, that the fragments that shattered and brought up again. I always talk about that because for me, it's I started a lot of these paintings from an explosion scene because it is something that really affected me when I was in Iraq, when I worked with the Associated Press, and I didn't confront that kind of shock until I left Iraq and felt safer and started being able to talk about it with my work. And I tried to replicate these scenes, and it's a shattered scene. It's a scene that destroys the body and the physical elements around it, and I tried to bring it back. And this example, City Face, this is a very direct example to that, and it's an older work. So what I'm trying to do is essentially bringing these bodies back to life, but without even admitting it. So it is really different. It's like it doesn't follow a formula. It happens organically, and it kind of start creating itself, and I highlight it. And sometimes there are certain works like Verdict that is direct to that. This one is unfinished, the one you're showing.
Mm-hmm.
It's an uncompleted work, and it's, I was watching all these images of masks, and obviously a lot of artists already started painting or sculpting these masks. And I was just like, I'm never gonna paint any mask. I don't want to didn't want a direct reference in the work. And then I started having this figure on the right that is laying down,
Mm-hmm.
that has this terrifying mask from, the plague days in Europe. So I kept it because, and I don't know where I'm going to go with it, but kind of it's asking to be there. So
There's some animal figures in there too, it looks like.
yes, and there is a figure that comes from the ancient temples in, Ur and Babylon and Mesopotamia, Iraq now. These are deities that used to, they used in these temples to as a figure of protection, as a symbol of protection. So all these figures came organically into this painting. The painting started from a very chaotic scene of explosion, and I just wanted to highlight a lot of these figures, but not really give them identity. So I'm still playing with this work and seeing where it goes. And then I was also thinking of flags, and obviously you can see a reference for the American flag, but it's going in different directions. So I'm still interested in seeing where this work will go. It has a few more steps, or I don't know. I mean, I might keep the mask because I feel it's very true to our time.
Yeah, I mean, you think so organically, like you said, about the figures that emerge, the patterns, but also the color, I imagine, is something that's an organic process. Or what's the very first thing that maybe begins when you've got a blank canvas? Do you pick colors? Do you maybe pick a figure that you think you might isolate? Talk a little bit about how some of this takes form as you're making it. Like, I know this blue path, the blue kind of comes in later, right? You sort of add that
Yeah. Mhm.
a little bit
Well,
later.
um, a lot of times the beginning, the first stage will be about maybe 20 drawings somewhere in my head or executed. And then I start picking the size there or the shape of the canvas. And lately, as you've seen, I've been really working with very large sizes.
Mhm.
This is what I am comfortable working within. It's like anything that is bigger than the dimensions of my arm. So um, I feel like it's just more true to the experience of walking. I want people to the viewers, just to experience that body that is bigger than their body. Most of the time, the works start flat, and that's when I normally will pick 5 main colors that to create that scene of an explosion,
Mhm.
and work with different tools, from brush to spray paint to you know um, very large kind of brushes, that is household item, that I normally use just to use my body weight to stretch with the color, and it becomes an act of, it's an extended action from my body. So I'm trying to allow my body to be part of this work as well. And creating these gestures doesn't happen very intentionally. Sometimes it's just the color will decide in the end if it's going to interact with the contrasting color next to it. So that's the first stage most of the time. Then I repeat this process like 5 to 10 times until I have an interesting shape or body to highlight. So I start finding this, and for me, this act, as brutal as it sounds, it replicates the act of cleaning up a explosion scene where it's very difficult to refer to, but you start collecting body parts from the street of people who were alive just hours ago. And for me, that kind of trauma, that horrendous situation, I'm trying to reverse that and bring it back into some sort of life and bring back that intensity to create something visually appealing versus a death scene. So I'm trying to bring back a scene into life, but in a way that it wouldn't exist in reality. You would not see these figures and these relationships and strings and ribbons in real life. So this is essentially the process. And it's a brutal thing. It comes from a very brutal base, but for me, it's bringing things back to life or trying to make sense of it.
Mhm. Well, I think there's a very rich tradition, I think, in abstraction that is very much tied to expression and sort of and gestures. When we think of a lot of abstract expressionists, we're thinking of their gestural movements which cause the mark or cause the mark making on the canvas. And I think you're really kind of you're embodying that physically, because this is a very gestural process in how they're made, and you're recording that process as you're building up these canvases and building up your paint. So I think that you kind of thinking about the sort of violence that comes with a war and an explosion, and how maybe you are acting in your studio, recreating that gestural process, I think is a very rich part of this and a very essential part of this. And so I'm wondering, in this current moment, when we're talking about the pandemic, there's been a lot of terms thrown around that compare this to a war. In fact, even the word war has been used as like, we are at war. And so I wonder, from an artist like you specifically, who has dealt with this subject for a long time, the specifics of a war, what do you think about that terminology as artists begin to absorb the pandemic, absorb the economic and sort of societal issues that are going to stem from this? What are your thoughts about comparing this to a war?
I have mixed feelings about this, because I believe that, people could use any term they want. I've been noticing that all of us right now, or most of us, are interrogating everything we're, witnessing or hearing about in the media, and using terms of war, or comparing this time to the Spanish flu pandemic time or to the plague. So a lot of people are trying to make sense of it in their own way. But from my own, experience with the, few wars, if not more, that I lived: Iraqi-Iranian War, Gulf War, the occupation or liberation of Iraq, however you feel about it. All these are times that led me and a lot of Iraqis seek shelter, or shelter within our own homes, or hide. And it is a very different situation, because first of all, we still have food here. We can go to the supermarket. We have, technology that we're using to stay communicating. And we have a lot of things that we didn't have in a war zone. And it's, I understand people are trying to compare that. It is a war of some sort, but, we have a war against a virus, against medical need. Again, we have people dying. It's a very drastic time, but it's a little bit different from being in an actual war zone, where not only you're afraid for your life, but you have no resources sometimes, if not most of the time, of eating or, transportation or anything. You're sheltered within somewhere. You're seeking shelter maybe in a different place. And in the case in 2003, my family and I escaped to another village that was occupied later by the militias of the dictator, while the American troops were arriving. So there was shooting happening randomly. Civilians were dying, and we were trying to escape back to our house in Baghdad that was not safe yet. So that's a war situation, and it gets worse. But again, people relate to things in a certain way, and I think it's their right, but it's very different. Like right now, I have a very good situation in my house. I can paint, I can eat, I can sit outside. I feel very privileged. So that's how I feel about it. But, it's, I could see why people also compare that to that situation as well, if they haven't lived it personally.
Yeah, I mean, I think people, we're a country with 300 million people, and so you're gonna have, and with a lot of artists, and people are gonna process this differently, and they're all gonna have different experiences too. I mean, there are probably lots of artists who have an extension to the medical profession, for example, and they're probably seeing a very violent daily sort of situation occur before their eyes. Again, maybe not in a war like you lived through, but still something that's sort of like decimating a lot of people in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Unclaimed bodies being buried in unmarked mass graves and things like that. So I feel like there are many connections, but you have certainly developed a body of work that has evolved from a very specific kind of destruction. And it's evolving into this sort of new era, like this image, that we talked about with this mask. You're taking a lot of this information, but it's still this texture and the surfaces of your paintings still are very much connected to a very different type of war experience.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I just was thinking, so we have some other images here. I know a lot of these are works in progress. This is scenes from your studio. But if there's anything specifically that, you wanted to talk about with these paintings that I haven't talked about or that we've addressed that you think is of interest to this moment or not?
Yes. Briefly with the previous works that I started a month ago, which is the work with the mask, and the works that has two, if you see there are pairs in every painting.
Mm-hmm.
I was trying to also allude to what's happening, with the people who are dying alone under ventilators in the hospitals. They can't even be surrounded by their loved ones, and they're probably surrounded by someone they don't know. And I read a lot of touching stories about that, where people were saying goodbye to their father or their grandmother via FaceTime. And I've been hearing these stories, and then naturally some of these images emerges, like the one that is to the left. It is uncompleted work, obviously, and it already looked different than this photo. But there are three figures, and there is a body in the middle. I don't know if you could really see it, with a red face that is kind of going somewhere. And it's kind of a moment of deliverance of, a soul. But I also trying not to really make this very dramatic and connected directly, like visually. So I'm building this kind of all the green. I'm trying to build these images of pools or water bodies that is going to take over these paintings essentially in the end. So trying to also connect that to happier moments of relaxing within nature. So it's like being in this kind of dramatic, chaotic scene, but also then going to somewhere that is more peaceful. So these works are developing. I started 4 works that is kind of this similar color, similar subject, and it's still developing as I work on these every day. And these paintings, this one specifically, I actually started it when I was doing the work for the triennial at KMAC.
Mm-hmm.
And I haven't completed until last week. They're almost done. But I felt like sadly, this is what the pandemic gave me. This situation is, that kind of really strong urge to complete these works. It kind of made me feel very anxious, that this anxiety went into completing the painting, which is necessary for a lot of my work. My work doesn't come from a lot of happy places, but it is trying to make sense of things. So yeah, that's what I was thinking about these specific paintings
I think
showing.
You brought up water, and I think that there's a fluidity. I mean, clearly within painting the way you paint, that is a great analogy here. But also the figures that you put into these images, as you were kind of just illuminating, they're not always really defined, and they're in a process of transition. As you talked about End of Hostilities, this transition from being in Iraq, coming to the States in a somewhat more peaceful existence. However, now with maybe issues of displacement, being away from home, being away from your family, being away from your culture. And so the constant sort of use of this kind of fluid background or fluid foundation in which these figures emerge allows for this kind of transitional reading of your work that I think is quite nice, because we don't always know if the figures are buried or in pain or if they're emerging, or, you know, and so I think that the fact that there's no defined intention, but they involve or encapsulate all of these different emotions and situations that you're coming through, not always negative, sometimes it's a positive.
There is a lot of, you know, for me, these fluidity and the bodies of water and these strings or sheets or however, you know, the viewers refer to, it represents somehow adaptability for me, because not just myself, but all my family, we had to adapt to a lot of different things in life. We had to go through situations where we were faced immediately without any preparation. And I believe that this is really showing in these paintings, you know, the transition from a situation into the next, with the intention to live through it, with, you know, to thrive through it, to survive it. So it has a very positive kind of meaning for me personally. It does show in a dramatic way where it's kind of things are splitting or connecting or being dragged back into a situation. Because I, until this day, after being in the US for a decade, still dealing with an aftermath of displacement, economics, and, you know, situation that lead into not being able to go to see family members when they're dying in Iraq or something like that. So it's all a very true reflection of my personal narrative. And, you know, there's always a space for more additions and imagination about new compositions and color. So that's the fun part for me, is where I could get with this work.
Yeah, I mean, I think despite this history that you're dealing with and that you kind of portray within your paintings, you find a lot of beauty in it. I think that's a really powerful thing for all of us to think about right now, like how to find beauty in these moments, in these sort of tragic situations. And I think your paintings do that, and they help us see that. So I really appreciate that.
I'm glad you see it this way. Yeah, I mean, that's what it tried to do. And you know, there's always got to be a space for beauty and
Right.
hope and the, you know, in life and work.
Well, Vian, I think that may be close to our time. So I'm just going to say thank you for talking with me today about this, and good luck and stay safe.
Same to you, Joey. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Have a great day.
Yep.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.